Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Pub Ops, and I'm Tyler Bishop. And joined alongside me today again is Simon Andrews. Simon, we had such a delightful chat last month talking a little bit about GAFA. I thought we would shift gears a little bit and actually shift sides of the world and talk a little bit about China. But first, welcome back. Thanks for joining us again.
Well, it's a pleasure. I enjoyed last time. It's interesting. Um, I enjoy matching of wits and answering your questions. So looking forward to it again. And
Well,
China's a
hopefully,
great subject.
Well, hopefully we can dive into some subjects that are both interesting to our audience and maybe somewhat enlightening, because I know that these are topics that you cover quite a bit, and I'm hoping that you can maybe fill me in on some things that maybe I'm not quite up to date on. So, kind of starting there, you recently mentioned in your newsletter that there are three firms that people traditionally think about as it relates to China: Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent. But now we've got names like ByteDance, JD.com, VIP Shop, Ant, and others kind of emerging as powerful players there. Previously, these were kind of all lumped together as bad, those first three that I mentioned.
Yeah.
But this group is growingly diverse. And I guess what elements of this market are being missed by kind of lumping all of these Chinese tech companies together under one category?
Well, it's really interesting that BAT came up around 6, 7 years ago, and everyone liked it because it was quite a simple way to think about it. It also was quite neat because it fitted quite well with GAFA. So you had Baidu, which is a bit like Google because it's search, and Alibaba, which is a bit like Amazon because it's e-commerce, and Facebook was like Tencent or social. You just realize that, in the 5 or 6 years, there have been huge changes. And I was staggered to find that Baidu has gone from being one of the peers of Alibaba and Tencent to, in a chart we saw, it's the number 11th biggest company in China now. So it's gone from 3rd to 11th. And the main reason for that is it's still largely an advertising-driven business. So it makes most of its money from advertising like Google does, from search. But in the meantime, Baidu and Tencent have grown into so many different ways with lots of different revenue streams, so making much more money than Baidu is. And as you say, along come all these different companies, some of which we've heard of, some we haven't, but all very interesting and with quite different businesses. So in the top 10, there's, my pronunciation is terrible, but one called Miting Dianping, which is a bit like a Grubhub or Uber Eats. So it's built around delivery of foodstuffs and lots of things around there. That's a huge company. You've got Dido, which is their equivalent of Uber in there. So you've got loads of business models which match up to what we've got in the West. These companies have grown very quickly. And what you find when you dig around, that Alibaba and Tencent have been quite involved in these companies and invested in there as well. So they've still got their fingers in lots of pies.
Yeah, and that's actually something that I find really interesting, because every time it seems like I'm reading about market news in China, whether they're talking about Jack Ma or Alibaba Group or Tencent, it seems like you'd mentioned, that they seem to be fairly invested in some of these growing tech businesses. And so Ant Group is one in particular that's gotten a lot of press in the West recently, mainly because the word is they might set some kind of record for the largest IPO in history. And what I find kind of interesting about that is they seem to have tapped their own users for nearly 9 billion USD for early IPO, quote unquote, mutual funds. And in this age where we've seen companies like Asana and Slack and several others use direct listings, foregoing some of the major investment banks, and SPACs as forms of going to market. I'm curious if you think that this kind of democratic form of crowdsourcing early IPO funds from basically customers or users is a trend that we'll maybe see emerge just across the tech landscape.
I think it's a great question. I think it's interesting. Ant was originally part of Alibaba. It was Alipay, which then launched, and it's grown to be, it's now the most valuable fintech in the world. And I think you're right, the rumors are a huge IPO. The way they've funded themselves is quite interesting, because back to the point we made about Tencent and Alibaba is growing so quickly, they've got business models other than advertising. So people are used to paying money to these different companies for different things. And obviously, if I take a car ride across Beijing, I pay Didi for that. If I'm getting a food delivery, I pay for that. There's quite a lot of things where they will pay for content, gifting, influence, things like that. So there is a sort of a legacy, not a legacy. There's a tradition of, I use my money and get something from these companies. And I think that Ant have just taken that and added like a rocket to it. And here you can buy shares in the company. But what's quite interesting is that some of these companies have listed in the US, and Ant I think is planning to list in the US. There's quite a lot of patriotic fervor about more and more Chinese companies are listing in China, in Hong Kong or whatever, and it's about listing at home. So there's a little bit of that. So I think that you have the Chinese population, the middle class is pretty wealthy. They fund lots of real estate around the world because people will buy, sell to Chinese investors, flats in New York or Miami or San Diego, etc. from there. So people have money to spend, and I think they've recognised, like people have in the West, that there's not many better place to invest your money for growth than tech companies. So they've got their own set of tech companies. So it's a long answer, but I think they're tapping into that nature of it. But they're also designing different models of doing this. And the whole thing about China is looking at those different models. Can we adopt some of that in the West? So I guess everyone's looking at that. If you can fund it from your own customers, who else could do that in Europe or around the States?
Yeah, it's an interesting proposition, and it's interesting as well that you mentioned the nationalistic property of it, because I think and I won't profess to be a brilliant financial mind, but the way that many of the stocks are bought and sold here in the West for companies like Tencent and Alibaba, it's essentially a note that lives on the New York exchange, but it's not necessarily tied to the actual stock of the company that's still listed in Hong Kong or wherever. And one of the things that I find particularly interesting about that is there's been this kind of back and forth, and where these names may sound familiar to many here in the US is there's been this talk recently of sanctions between the US and China, and essentially blocking some of these platforms and technologies, particularly with the US blocking someone like ByteDance or Tencent, WeChat, and things like that. What do you make of this tension? Is this a real Cold War between the US and China, and are these businesses just kind of pawns in that, or is this just a lot of political posturing and positioning? Is this going to define the future of some of the companies that we've been discussing here today?
Well, I think it's a really interesting question. I think there's a lot of political posturing, and it's quite hard to work out what's happening with TikTok and WeChat now. My understanding is that the court overturned the closing down of WeChat, so that's continuing as normal. The TikTok thing seems to just, no one seems interested because no one understands what the deal was or what they were buying anyway from there. So it's sort of gone away. Someone put the Financial Times put it very well that TikTok have just taught people, Chinese companies, you can go to the West, build a big business and upset people and get away with it because it looks like they've got away with it from there. But what you have to remember is the reason why China has so many interesting different companies is what we call the Galapagos effect. So Galapagos, these islands off in the Pacific, which actually everything, evolved differently because they didn't have, the influence from other parts of the world. And China's the same thing, because China decided very early on, no Facebook, you can't come in, no Google, you can come in, but you have to censor Tiananmen Square, and when you stop doing that, you're out. No Amazon. Apple's obviously there, because Apple is a huge market for Apple, but most of it, they closed those businesses down. So and this was part of the rhetoric about TikTok, when you complain about that, well, wait a minute, China, you don't let any of our companies run, so why should we let your companies run? And the answer is, well, actually, we're not a military authoritarian state, and we open the world to those things. So I think there's a little bit of Cold War about that. I think one of the things is that China is, strong economy, and the West is, sort of neutral at the moment for various reasons. So I think you'll continue to see growth from there. I'm not sure that anyone, I don't understand American politics anything like enough to know whether someone will try and pick the TikTok thing if Trump isn't there in November. I suspect it's just, we're going to continue to carry on as a bit like normal. The one thing you worry about is the security. So on Huawei, building a whole system that every communication for you and me and our prime minister and whatever goes through Chinese owned technology, that maybe sounds quite risky. And that's where you can do dances to doesn't sound quite as much of a threat, does it really?
Yeah, I mean, it really is sort of bizarre, where you had companies like Microsoft, which initially didn't make the most sense in the world, but you could kind of get there in terms of buying someone like ByteDance, their portion of, or I guess their American side of the TikTok business, and then all of a sudden Oracle and Walmart of all people were involved. And now I'm not sure anyone really understands where that deal is at, and if, like you said, if Trump isn't the president, or even if he is, what will happen with this? So I do find it it's a bit of a soap opera to follow.
Just one thing I know, you mentioned Walmart, which is quite interesting because I was a bit surprised, but then they're competing very hard against Amazon, so having all those TikTokers as an audience, but Walmart are big investors in China. JD.com, which is came out of I think Tencent. Walmart has got a big stake in there, and they've got big investments in India, as to Amazon from there. So they have got sort of more of they're doing more than you perhaps think of them as a sort of just a supermarket chain in the US from there. But I don't know, who knows with things like that. But the Chinese companies are going to keep growing and keep innovating. So there's plenty still worth watching, I think.
Yeah, it is sort of interesting where you have some of these, I would say, kind of legacy, for lack of a better category, retailers in many cases, like a Walmart or even a McDonald's, who's invested in a lot of AI technology recently, really starting to become more of a technology business than what many people think in terms of maybe just investments, but also some of the synergies in their products. And I find that there's a lot of correlations between this and the gaming market, where China is pretty much the greatest gaming market in the world, and it remains in the orbit of many of the companies we discussed. Tencent, for example, in the West, Fortnite has been especially popular, with cultural influencers like Travis Scott penetrating that medium and becoming very popular for hosting a virtual concert. Virtual concerts have always been kind of met with this kind of like, seems kind of lame, for lack of a better term. It's never been something that got off the ground, but for whatever reason, this medium has been perfect for it. And so I'm curious what other innovations in gaming are occurring in the East that will be discovered by the rest of the world here in the I guess coming months or years.
Well, I think you're right. It's a huge market. Something like 500 million people play mobile games in China. It's quite an interesting market in that the government they're involved in everything, as we sort of gather. They've banned various games because they didn't portray the right view about China, or they were felt to be the wrong thing for users. And they're very concerned about people playing games too much. So there's a curfew on gaming in China. So you can't play games after 10 o'clock at night and before 8 o'clock in the morning. And you're also regulated. I think under 18s are regulated. You only play 90 minutes during the week and 3 hours a day at the weekend. So it's quite a lot of, you can't imagine that going down very well in the West if that was to be imported. But it's a huge market, because China has always been mobile first, so they never had a desktop world. Consoles were sort of allowed in and sort of banned a while ago. So it was mobile that people discovered gaming on. And it's grown to be really popular. It's interesting that Tencent have stakes in loads of the best gaming companies. If you find the European ones in Finland, American as well, you usually find that Tencent's got 10, 20, 30% more of that. So they're a major player in there. And I guess what we're starting to see is IP transferring from China in and out. I'm not a gamer, so I'm not too familiar with the ones that are working there. But again, the question of money is quite interesting, because obviously gaming is a huge source of revenue in the West. But it's, I think it's Tencent make about 16% of their money from gaming, and make from advertising, but a quarter from online gaming. And again, there's another regulation. Each person is limited on the amount of money they can spend in games in a month as well. So it's a fascinating market. There's interesting sort of rules from there. But I don't think things like Fortnite and the sort of the Epic world has touched China yet. So it'd be interesting to see how that responds in that way. Something I should dig into, I think.
Yeah, it would be interesting, and you mentioned where they extract the revenue from the gaming and the advertising itself. And one of the things that I find really interesting, because they they parallel the gaming place, but it's things like, if you would have told me 10 years ago that a platform called Twitch was going to allow people to live stream people playing video games, and that would be tremendously popular and a major source of revenue and an Amazon acquisition, I would have thought that was a storybook or a fairy tale. And here we are. And I think one of the things that I find interesting about this is you see a lot of these things emerge in the East in terms of popularity before they do in the West. And one area I'm particularly interested in, I know you've written about this before in your newsletter, and that is live commerce or live shopping, tremendously popular in China and not something that's spread with the same ferocity across the rest of the globe. And I'm a bit curious as to, personally, I'm a bit curious as to why. And I sort of feel like that wave must be coming, but I sort of wonder when. And so I wonder when you think we might adopt something like that, or if you can answer some my kind of puzzling questions about why we haven't seen this emerge yet here.
Well, I don't know why it hasn't arrived here. A little bit of a backstory. There's a guy called Barry Diller who runs IAC, who's coming behind Expedia and Tinder. It's a huge internet business, very sophisticated business. But before he got into that, he was a big wheel in Hollywood. He ran Paramount, he ran one of the TV networks or whatever from there. There's a great story about early 90s. He got nothing to do, and his girlfriend was Diane von Furstenberg. And one day she said, "Why well, come to me on Wednesday? I'm getting a plane to this place in the middle of nowhere in the States." So I went with her on a private plane, landed in this little TV station. So, she goes off into the studio and he sits outside, looking at his watch waiting to go. And she's talking being interviewed on this program. And suddenly all these lights light up, outside. And Barry says, "What are those lights?" "Oh, they're calls." "Well, people are calling in to talk to my girlfriend." "No, they're calling in to buy the dresses she's talking about." And that was when he realized the power of commerce. That someone, Diane von Furstenberg, took on probably an early QVC, which he then bought QVC. And he learned that, selling stuff is really powerful, and that the best way of selling stuff is things like QVC, where someone's talking about it from there. So I'm fascinated by in China. It's absolutely huge. My favorite story is, different people over there doing different things. But they sold 3,000 Tiffany necklaces at $3,500 each in an hour. They've sold a £5.5 million rocket on a live stream. The equivalent of, you think like Whirlpool's at white goods manufacturers, the CEO of that company is this, interesting woman. She did a 3-hour show and sold $43 million worth of white goods in the 3-hour show. Farmers do it to sell apples. It's an established way of selling things. And it works really well because I've got a friend who's a QVC presenter in the UK. And he can sell £200,000-300,000 worth of coats in an hour just by talking about them when people ring in and buy them. That has to happen in the West. And if you look, Facebook is trying to do that with Instagram. Amazon got Amazon Live and do it for beauty. YouTube have just announced that they're going to they're asking creators to tag products in their films that they make using YouTube software. So it's all moving towards that. But I wonder, you need somewhere to go. So QVC, when it's on television or wherever, you're going to find it from there. You need a destination. No one seems to find that destination. Snapchat have got a show in Discovery, I think starts sometime this winter, which is a sort of menswear show, and that's going to, fashion. So again, you've got to buy from there. So it feels like all the bits are coming together. It will happen sometime. I think it'll happen very quickly because, people like to buy things. E-commerce has grown so much from there. So I think it's inevitable. But the numbers in the States are just phenomenal. And again, you see these things. If it works in the States, obviously there's a cultural difference. So it works in China. Why won't it work somewhere else? And it feels like one of the things that's very copyable and very likely to come to us before too long. But I'm wondering, why it's taking as long as it is.
So one thing I'm curious about, and you might be able to answer this, in China, whenever the majority of live commerce or live shopping, is this occurring through essentially one platform or one technology, or is this something that's widespread across multiple platforms and technologies? Is it more of I guess a medium, or is it actually, kind of proprietary to a handful or small number of platforms?
Well, what we see looking at China is, when someone does something that works well, Alibaba, some of the Tencent copies that and vice versa. And, all these other companies are all copying each other. There's a lot of crossover in different business models. So I think that most people are doing it. There's, around the sort of Singles Day and those big events that, they invented, they're having on live shopping. So I think most people are doing it now. There's an interesting one called Little Red Book, which is a more upmarket shopping platform. The one sector that hasn't really taken up in e-commerce in China is luxury. Luxury has been quite careful to keep away from it. A bit like in the West, they've kept away from Amazon, etc. They've been quite careful not to get too involved with the big platforms in China. But luxury brands are very important in China, and China is very important for luxury brands. But LVMH have done some live shopping with Little Red Book because that's, has the right cachet for their customers. The Tiffany one, I think, was on a different platform. So you find that most of the platforms are doing this, but will have different people. So the king of lipstick, who's a 23-year-old guy, sells huge amounts. He's on one platform. The farmers are on another platform, etc. But most of them have something, in this space from there. So it feels it's very copyable.
Do you feel like there's anyone from GAFA, Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, that is maybe poised to capitalize on this maybe more than one of the others?
I think that I always come back to Amazon. They've got, so Facebook with Instagram, and IGTV and Facebook Watch are all moving in that direction. They've got lots of brands on there. Google, we talk about YouTube and they've got the Google Shopping, but Amazon feel the ones that are better able to knit together the fact they're really good at video. They've got huge Prime Video platform. They're now, getting inventory from most of the connected TV services that they're sort of selling. So Peacock and whatever. I'm not sure if they've done a deal with Peacock, but most of them have got inventory. So to actually match that up with their shopping was seem quite interesting. And the thing I think we talked about last time, the thing that I always think of is, the secret sauce. Amazon will be able to show ads and then know whether people have bought them from there. And that makes them much more powerful than everyone who sort of thinks someone bought something or they may have bought something from there. So imagine they can combine those assets better than somebody else. What we are seeing, those little startups who are going to brands and saying, we'll add live shopping onto your brands. So H&M have done it with a Swedish startup. In Germany, there's another one called Lisa, which lets people do. So people are playing around at this. And it's one of those things that, it's on the edges, it's quite small, but I imagine it'll grow quite quickly. But my money would be on Amazon to nail it. And Amazon Live, on beauty, they do quite big business on there already. They don't talk about figures, but it looks like it's quite a big business for them.
And I have one last question for you, just because it's something that you had mentioned earlier, and I found it interesting because I started to think about, you were talking about some of the restrictions on the use of video games and the amount of money that people can spend on them and things like that in China. And I started to think about all the different, just emerging kind of trends that we've been talking about today. And one of the things that generally comes up or is often said here in the US is that maybe quite narcissistic on our part, but we would say that the West or the US in particular, our number one export is innovation. That said, it seems like many of the ideas and concepts that are emerging, at least digitally, are coming from China, yet inside of the kind of walled garden that is China, many of these things are restricted and innovations from outside have been kept out. So do you believe that the future of many of the things that we as consumers will engage with and include as a part of our normal behavior, is that going to come from the East, or do you think it's going to come from the West, or are we really in a global economy now where these things are going to sort of find their own way out in the ecosystem?
Well, a friend of mine who lived in Hong Kong for a while explained China to me about 10, 12 years ago. I didn't really understand the whole China thing. He told me two things. One is the Chinese population means that every year it's like 25 million kids come out of school looking for a job. And what they worry about, if 25 million kids don't have a job, they're going to cause trouble or whatever. So they've built an economy to produce 25 million new jobs every year to cope with them. And that's the reason it's growing so much from there, which I thought was really interesting and makes perfect sense. The other thing he said, that if you talk to Chinese people, they think they ran the world until about the 18th, 19th century, and it's just going back to normal now. So there's sort of right side from there. I was with somebody yesterday, a little D2C company, and they're pointing out one of their products, and they got it from Shenzhen, I was saying that, if you're trying to buy anything hardware, China is just the best place in the world because they're all innovating, changing things, making things better from there. But the guy said they're not as good as on software. And I said, well, you look at WeChat and all these different things. But what I said to him, someone told me this story about the advantage China has is a thing called 996. So most people in tech companies in China, I think most companies, but you work 6 days a week from 9 in the morning till 9 at night, and that's just accepted. That means you're doing 72 hours a week. That's twice as much as the average person in the West working 9 to 5. So these people, as smart as us, they've got the history behind them. They feel that they deserve to be running the world, and they're putting twice as much effort as most people in the West in. So I think we can expect to keep seeing stuff coming from them because there is that hunger and that sort of drive behind it, and it's hard to compete with.
Someone that spent a lot of time working with software developers, sometimes giving them more time, it just gives them more things to mess up and more bugs for the users to sort out. But it's certainly a very interesting way of thinking about it, isn't it? The 25 million people and to support 25 million jobs. That is sort of fascinating. Well, Simon, I'll leave it at that unless there's anything else that you think that we've touched on today that you think would be interesting to share. But
just two things which I came up with in prep from, which I hadn't really realized. So one is there's 900 million people on the internet who have a mobile phone in China, and all but 3 million are on the internet. So that's why it's such a big market. But there's 600 million more people in China who have not yet got mobile phones. So that growth is going to come there as well from there. And then they make a big thing about 5G. So 5G, iPhone launched last night with 5G, but in the UK, you haven't really sort of pushed it very far. Neither have in the States. In China, they're hoping to have 190 million people using 5G by the end of this year. Every of their major cities, which is 250 major cities, has got 5G installed now. And Mount Everest has 5G. They've put a base station like Mount Everest just for the PR value, I think, from there. So the whole 5G thing, and the 5G thing, that extra speed, I think, again, we talk, what takes an hour takes a minute, what took a minute takes a second. That speed of things is quite an interesting factor as well. So it just feels that there's a lot more to come because there's a lot more people to come and more growth, and that 5G is going to change things as well from there.
Yeah, it certainly seems interesting. There seems to be a debate around whether people have been waiting for the hardware or a particular innovation to kind of drive this sort of enthusiasm for 5G, which Verizon CEO, I believe, made that exact comment at Apple's announcement of the iPhone 12, which obviously is going to have 5G capabilities as well earlier this week. So very fascinating information to watch, and definitely worth paying attention to what's going on in China in the East. And Simon, your newsletter, Mobile Fix, is a great resource for kind of plugging into that. Is there anything else that our listeners should be paying attention to and things that you have going on?
Well, the only other thing that, someone sort of talked to me about is, Simon, it's not just China. Because Indonesia's got 250 million people and got a fantastic ecosystem. India, there's a whole load of stuff going on in Asia, which I think, we might watch China, we might watch India, we're missing, all these other countries as well. So there's a lot happening in the East, Benedict Evans did a great presentation, a paper this week. It's the end of the American internet. All the great companies came out of Silicon Valley, but now there's more people with mobile internet in China than there is in Western Europe and US combined. So it's no longer an internet that's for us perfect because it's written in English and it's about things we know about. That's changing. So we just need to keep an eye on the rest of the world and what they're doing as well, because I think there's a lot to learn from that.
Simon, once again, I could probably talk to you all day about these topics and dig in deeper and deeper, but I'll leave it at that. So I want to thank you again for joining the show. And where can our listeners find you and subscribe to your newsletter?
Thank you, Tyler. If you go to addictivelondon.com, you can sign up for Fix there. Thanks for your time. I enjoyed the conversation, and let's do it again sometime.
Yeah, let's do it again, and we'll find something else that I'm sure our audience will find fascinating. You're a man of knowledge of many different topics that I am interested in learning more about and digging into deeper. So I'm sure we can find a couple things to talk about next time. So thank you again, and we'll catch you next time on Pub Ops.